we're so lucky. We are always so lucky to have such high caliber speakers with us every month. This month is no exception. We're going to be covering a topic that's often underestimated, particularly in early years, and that is mentoring. We've got early years lecturer and author, Dr. Mona Sakr, and she's going to help us explore how mentoring can be used as an effective way to improve the culture of any nursery setting. She's going to discuss what great mentoring looks like, why it makes a difference to our staff relationships and to increase motivation, and what support we can put in place to enable effective mentoring. A little bit about Mona herself. She's a senior lecturer in education and early childhood. She's published extensively on creative, digital and playful pedagogies. Her current research is an exploration of pedagogical, organisational and community leadership in early years and how leadership can be more effectively developed across the sector. She's co-written a book with Juno Sullivan, Chief Exec of the London Early Years Foundation, called Social Leadership in Early Childhood Education and Care. We'll put the link to that on the email after the webinar. And today, she's going to be discussing why mentoring improves motivation and relationships, what great mentoring looks like, as we said, how mentoring could be supported through resources, routines, and culture within the setting, and the potentials of reverse mentoring. So without further ado, over to you, Mona.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Gail. Thanks so much, Adele. I'll go ahead and share my screen and we can get started. And I will just warn you all that I am not feeling my best and healthiest self. So if there's coughing going on and lots of sips of hot drinks and water, then just bear with me. But this is a subject that I'm really passionate about and excited to be here with you today, exploring in Mentoring Week. So this is a celebration of a special week of the year where we really celebrate the power of mentoring. I'm going to be thinking about the power of mentoring to build what we would call a learning nursery. I'm only going to speak for maximum 20 minutes so that we can really maximize the time that we have for questions, for comments, for dialogue. It's always the best bit of any session. So first thing I plan to do is talk about this vision of a learning nursery. What is a learning nursery? How does it look? How does it feel? And then we'll consider how mentoring plays a part in building a learning nursery. What does great mentoring involve? How does it make a difference to staff relationships, to staff motivation, and to very concrete outcomes that we're all thinking about and concerned about, like retention, like progression, like leadership development. We'll talk about the benefits of mentoring, both for the mentee, but also for the mentor. And that's well established within research that actually mentoring benefits both parties that are involved in an effective mentoring relationship. We'll also think about the leader's role in supporting all of this. So firstly, how leaders can support effective mentoring across a nursery, or even within a particular bit of a nursery, a room, for example. But we'll also think about how leaders can model the benefits of mentoring and of being mentored through this fairly new process of reverse mentoring. So we'll talk about the potentials of reverse mentoring. Okay, let's get going. So my favorite thing to talk about is this vision of the learning nursery. So when we talk about the learning nursery, we're thinking about organizational culture within a nursery. So when you think about the nursery where you work, what are the words that come to mind? It might be some positive words like supportive, warm, encouraging. There might be some less positive words. It might feel constraining or demotivating or lacking inspiration. When we talk about a learning nursery, the organizational culture centers and puts at the heart of everything learning and development. Everybody's learning and development. So Robert Keegan, and you'll see his book displayed on the screen, and Everyone Culture talks about this as a deliberately developmental organization. And the idea is a place where you fulfill your potential as an individual. So you are maximally developed as an individual, but in doing so, you benefit the organization as well. So the idea here is that by maximizing the learning that everyone is doing at every single level, in every role, whether they've just joined the organization, whether they've been there for 8 years, you're generating a workplace that's transformational for individuals, but also in terms of what that organization delivers. So in our case, early years education, those crucial experiences in the early years of life. Now, hopefully, as early years educators, this idea of a learning nursery really speaks to us, because we're in the business of learning and development. It's everything that we're thinking about all of the time. We're thinking about children's learning. We're thinking about their development. With the idea of the learning nursery, we shift that and we think, well, yeah, the children are learning and so are we. Everybody in this organization is learning all of the time. We think about this, so myself and Juno Sullivan, we talk about this quite a lot in our social leadership book. The need for everyone to always feel that they're developing both personally and professionally, because those things are so intertwined. And the early years setting becomes a hub for development, a hub for development of children, of families, of parents, of staff, of its leaders. Now, in order to create this learning nursery, we need to draw on so many tools, so many kind of professional learning tools. We need to think about formal professional learning. We need to think about informal professional development. It might be training in-house. It might be training that's provided off-site. It might be reading materials that are left out in the staff room. It might be what we put up on the walls around us to inspire us day to day. It might be how we do our observations and the conversations that we have about those observations. It might be the reflective logs that we're encouraged to fill out about our practice. And again, the conversations that we can have about those reflections. It's all of those conversations and discussions that we do about our professional and personal development. Appraisals, supervisions, coaching, and, as is our focus today, mentoring. So when we talk about mentoring in particular, we're talking about a developmental process that typically happens through one-to-one conversations where there's an open space for individuals to reflect on their professional and personal development. It's different to an appraisal, it's different to a supervision, and it's different to coaching. It's this kind of reflective and open space that's created by the mentor and the mentee. I love this quote from Rod, which I think offers us a really exciting definition of mentoring. So Rod says that mentoring is an opportunity for colleagues to engage in reflective dialogue that can enhance feelings of empowerment, and success, and promote dispositions towards lifelong learning. So if we pause here and just kind of pick out some of those keywords and stay with those a little bit, it's reflective. So it is a space where we're trying to go in depth. We're not trying to quickly solve problems. We're trying to really probe what's going on and understand. It's not about ticking boxes. It's not about filling in paperwork. It's something that's going much deeper than that. It happens through dialogue. So in a dialogue, things are going back and forth. It's a genuine conversation. So it's not about issuing feedback to somebody. It's not about a mentor saying lots of things that they think will help their mentee to improve. But equally, it's not about kind of a mentor taking on a therapist role and simply nodding their head and kind of hearing what the mentee has to say. It's an authentic connection between the two individuals where the mentor can share what they think might be useful, but is also prepared to do the work of deep listening. And what we're aiming for through mentoring, and I think this is really important to remember because there is this pressure to kind of see improvements immediately, but what we're aiming for is something quite intangible. It's feelings. We're looking for feelings of empowerment. We're looking for feelings of success. And I would add to that we are looking for mentees and mentors through the process of mentoring to position themselves as learners. So mentoring is about reinforcing the learning nursery by helping everybody to see themselves as constantly learning, constantly growing, constantly developing. It's a never-ending process. So this is not a kind of 6-week intensive coaching program where we start with one issue and we make a great big leap in our practice. That's fantastic. That's another tool that we can use for a learning nursery. But with mentoring, we're looking at something that's much kind of more drawn out, where there isn't necessarily a beginning, a middle, and an end in a clear way. So if we take up Rod's definition, it leaves us lots of scope in terms of how practically mentoring can work in the workplace. It may be more or less formal, it may be happening on a weekly basis, a monthly basis, or even just as when it's felt to be kind of necessary by the mentee. So while there's still this openness, though, we do have and should have a clear sense of what the mentoring is all about. We need to be really clear about what it's not. So really clear that it isn't supervision or appraisal or this quick fix kind of coaching. And we need to be clear that the systems for mentoring are different and detached from the systems that we might set up for those other kinds of important conversations that we have within the nursery. It's also not about the mentor positioning themselves as an expert with all of the answers. So they may have ideas and suggestions, and these are offered in a spirit of dialogue and seeing how they land. But it is very much a dialogue, and a mentee must feel able to kind of engage in this process in an open way, where their opinions and perspectives and feelings matter. So the research on mentoring, both across all sectors, all organizations, and then particularly within early years, shows that it has a benefit for both mentors and mentees and how they feel about their work. So we see an increased sense of purposefulness. We see an increased sense of belonging. And that identity as a learner starts to really be reinforced through the process of mentoring. And all of these things are impacted whether you are the one being mentored or you are the one doing the mentoring, because after all, it is this dialogic relationship. Now, in turn, those feelings generate real outcomes. So in organizations that identify as learning organizations and use strategies like mentoring to support day-to-day learning, there is better retention. Employees are much more likely to commit to a particular organization and staying there, even if some of the tangible benefits are not fantastic, because they feel that they are developing as an individual. And we see that actually in terms of generations, the research across generations suggests that that's only ever more important. So the younger the employee, the more value seems to be placed upon this capacity to develop as a learner, as an individual. Is the organization giving me a chance to flourish? And that seems to just be more and more and more important in employees' thinking. There is also more effective career progression for both mentees and mentors. And linked to this, it's a key form of leadership development that we can offer in a relatively inexpensive but effective way. Again, that progression, that leadership development applies both to the mentees and the mentors. So from the perspective of the mentor, what better way to develop the empathy, the authentic listening that we want to see in our leaders today than to engage in a process of mentoring somebody else? Okay, so yeah, we see these kind of concrete outcomes in terms of retention, progression, and leadership development. I want to shift now to thinking about the role of leaders in supporting mentoring, because leaders play a vital role in helping mentoring to flourish in an organization. So in our case, in a nursery, a leader, whether it's a nursery manager, whether it's a room leader, they help to set up not just the system, but the culture in which mentoring can flourish. So when we're thinking about the support that leaders can give and how best they can set up a system of mentoring, we need to think around three things: dispositions, knowledge and skills, and roles and responsibilities. So if we start with the dispositions, your disposition is your attitude towards something. It's what you bring to a process. So when it comes to the dispositions involved in mentoring, I know that you'll have in your mind what the ideal attitude of a mentee and a mentor would be as they enter into that process of mentoring. So imagine a mentor who shows up for their mentoring looking bored, uninterested in what you have to say, who wants to get the session over and done with as quickly as possible. On the other hand, think about a mentor who thinks that they know it all, or just keeps on talking over the top of you without engaging in any kind of deep listening. The mentoring wouldn't work. It would have a detrimental effect, if anything. Similarly, though, if a mentee shows up and they appear to be very closed, they don't want to share too much information about their situation, they're maybe just asking very practical questions, or they're not asking questions at all, this would also get in the way of the process. So the first thing that a leader in a learning nursery is trying to establish and foster among all of the staff is a learning disposition that's going to work for something like mentoring. An attitude that's conducive to being open to this developmental process. Now, ideally, a leader is going to be encouraging everybody to get on board with that learning disposition. That's the longer term aim, right? We are trying to cultivate and shape dispositions so that we build this learning nursery. But if you're just getting mentoring going, if a system's in its initial stages, it's really important to actually limit the mentoring relationships to those individual staff members who can show this disposition straight away. It will be destructive to mentoring in an organization to have too many people involved, really any people involved, who are showing a negative learning disposition. Okay, so to protect mentoring in a nursery, particularly when it's at that fledgling stage, when it's a new thing within an organization, a good starting point is to seek out the individuals to match up as mentors and mentees who display the kind of disposition that we would want to see in that relationship. Longer term, the aim is to build learning dispositions across the organization. So that it's unusual to find any member of staff who doesn't identify as a learner. The second thing that leaders can support with when it comes to mentoring is skills and knowledge. So this is about recognizing that individuals get better as mentors. People aren't born a mentor. It's not something that some people just innately are good at and other people are innately bad at. It's something that emerges through an investment in you as an individual. So leaders have a crucial role to play in terms of cascading the knowledge and the skills through the organization about how to do great mentoring, and ensuring that if they don't have that knowledge and skills themselves, because after all, leaders are learners as well, and might have particular kind of gaps and weaknesses in their knowledge and skills, recognizing that they're going to need to bring in resources and training and professional development in order to support the team of mentors who are trying to do good things. So this might be mentor meetings. It might be professional learning outside of the setting that aims to upskill mentors. Finally, leaders can help mentoring to flourish by establishing and reinforcing clear expectations about what mentoring actually involves. So on a practical level, this might be putting together a one-page document that mentors and mentees sign at the beginning of the process, which outlines guidance for the process. So you know what the process should be, as well as what it's definitely not. So asking mentors and mentees to sign something that actually formally recognizes that this isn't supervision, that this isn't appraisal, that there's a commitment to reflective dialogue and regular review of how the process is going, can be something really supportive for both the mentor and the mentee. Beyond this kind of document that's signed by the two parties, it might be something that you put up around the nursery or in the staff room that emphasizes this particular power of mentoring. You might blow up in larger a quote from Rod about what mentoring is and have it up on the walls as a constant reminder for everyone, not just that we believe in the power of mentoring, but that mentoring is reflective dialogue and that it needs to be empowering in order for it to be effective. Okay, one other fundamental thing that leaders can do in relation to all aspects of organizational culture is modeling what they want to foster in the culture around them. So if they want to have a warm and supportive organizational culture, one of the most powerful tools that a leader has is their own warmth and supportiveness and the day-to-day interactions that demonstrate these qualities. Similarly, if leaders are striving towards a learning culture and a learning nursery, then they need to be seen to be learning themselves. Linking this back to mentoring, one of the ways that we can do that is through engaging in a process of reverse mentoring. Reverse mentoring is when a leader takes on the role of mentee, not just mentor, and they themselves are mentored by someone that in an official sense is junior to them. So for example, in a nursery, if the manager were to be mentored by the baby room leader, this would be reverse mentoring. Now, you might be wondering in that scenario, how would that work? How could the manager of a nursery bring their issues or their frustrations to the baby room leader without there being a conflict of interest there? It needs to be done with sensitivity on the part of the leader. So it's not a chance for the leader to just vent without thinking about what they're saying, the consequences of what they're saying. But they can use reverse mentoring to find out how things are happening on the ground as a consequence of their decision making, as a consequence of their leadership. So they might be asking questions about how decision X, Y, or Z has been received among staff within the nursery. Or what did you think of our last team meeting? How do you think I ran that team meeting? What do you think I could have done better? Reverse mentoring is particularly powerful if the mentor to the leader can be somebody who may be underrepresented within the setting. So for example, if there's just one or two male practitioners in a nursery, a leader might ask to be mentored by one of these members of staff in order to understand and empathize with that perspective. Or if the leader is sensitive to the way in which the baby room is often marginalized within the nursery context, they might ask to be mentored by somebody in the baby room so that they can gain that deeper understanding of how that team are working. There's so much potential here for gaining insights that from a leader's perspective can be transformational in terms of how we are leading others. Okay, I'm going to draw things to a close here so that we can prioritize our time for some dialogue and some comments and some questions. And that feels important if we're honoring the spirit of mentoring. So just to briefly sum up what we've talked about, the vision of the learning nursery, how mentoring can play a part in building that learning nursery, how it benefits both mentors and mentees, the kind of intangible outcomes, then the more concrete outcomes over the longer term, and also this role of the leader in setting up mentoring. So thinking about dispositions, thinking about skills, thinking about roles and responsibilities, but also the potential to model the power of mentoring through engaging in reverse mentoring. So thanks so much for listening to me, and I hope we can have some interesting thoughts together now.
Thank you so much, Mona. Thank you. Yes, we have been inundated with some questions. If you don't mind, I'll start asking you some. Okay, great. So we had a question from someone asking, should a mentor share the conversations with managers if the mentor is not a line manager for that person, for example?
What a fantastic question. So obviously there are situations where a conversation needs to go back to the appropriate person because something has been disclosed that's, you know, a risk. And so we do have to be aware as leaders setting up mentoring of risk and managing risk. However, I think ideally no would be the answer to that mentoring is a separate process from line management. And part of that separation is that the mentor is not reporting back to a line manager or to another manager within the setting, or ideally anybody else within the setting, what's been discussed. I think there's a kind of a protective bubble around mentoring that can really help it to flourish. Having said that, the limits around that, so for example, if there was a disclosure within the context of mentoring where it felt that something risky had been mentioned that put somebody at risk within the setting or needed to be disclosed, ideally what you'd have is in those expectations around mentoring, a lot of clarity around in which situations would your mentor need to tell somebody else about what you'd said, you know, and then everybody's going into it with open eyes. But I think that, yeah, sorry.
Do you have like a ground rules that you share with everybody? Because obviously confidentiality is very important for someone to be open with their mentor, to be able to express, you know, things that they are struggling with, that maybe they're not want to discuss with their manager to show weakness, for example. Is there like a document that you have available that we can share with our audience to be able to say, this is kind of the foundation, the kind of the ground rules to kind of make sure that when you implement this in your setting, that it's there?
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely, Adele. Yeah, I can share some things that would be useful. And I think it's important to strike a balance between those clear expectations, but also not making it really cumbersome. So that, you know, it shouldn't be a contract that feels like this huge legal document that needs to be signed by everybody. It needs to be something that's a kind of do's and don'ts. This is what we do, but this is what we try to avoid doing. So trying to strike that balance between keeping it simple, but also making it very clear. I think it's very hard for mentees to open up within a mentoring relationship if actually they feel that what they're going to say is just parroted back to somebody else. And, you know, and I think it's really difficult if there's a lack of clarity around that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. We had a question from Katie, which I thought was really interesting, asking, can we discuss in more detail about how coaching differs from mentoring, which I thought was quite interesting because it's quite a fine line, isn't it?
It is. And you know, it's more like a spectrum almost. So I wouldn't see it as they are two very separate things. And maybe in my presentation, I was a little bit harsh about that boundary. But the way to kind of, or the way I would see the difference between coaching and mentoring is that coaching is most effective when you define together an end goal. So you know that we are going to make together this level of progress, and you might spend some sessions together working out what that progress is going to be. But then the majority of the coaching is dedicated to achieving that goal and helping somebody to achieve that goal. With mentoring, there's a lot more openness about it. And so it might not be that there is a specific goal. It might be that there are lots of little goals that bubble up over time and that you address together and that you think about together. But it's less of a kind of, we are making a leap within a time-defined period. So typically with coaching, you'll want to set at the beginning, are we doing this for 8 weeks? Are we doing this for 8 months? It can differ, but you'll have some kind of time period in mind. With mentoring, you tend to be a lot more relaxed, you might say, right, we'll review after 10 weeks and see how we're getting on together, but not necessarily bring it to a close.
Brilliant. Okie dokes. A lot of the settings have younger staff members, and they might not be that confident. So one of the questions we had is, do you think, to help that conversation starting, do you think the use of case studies, sorry, just looking at the question, do you think the use of case studies is a good idea to be able to get that conversation going, ask questions based on the case study to say potentially, why do you think this happened? Could this have a different outcome if they did something else? Just to kind of get that person's opinion going, or do you not think that's appropriate?
I think that can work. I mean, I would suggest being responsive to the mentee, because I think mentees, regardless of age or background or anything, will come in very different to the mentoring relationship. And so some will be ready to share and chat very openly about what they're experiencing, and others might feel kind of tentative about sharing their opinions and their perspectives, and so they need something, some kind of fuel that's going to get them going. So where there is that kind of inhibition, I think case studies is a lovely way to do it. Scenarios, you know, so asking kind of specific questions about ideally bringing it back to their practice. So, you know, this is a scenario we can talk about. Does it relate to anything you've experienced in your practice? Can be a way, because ultimately you want to come back to their experiences. We don't want to create a mentoring relationship where it's kind of like a CPD course.
Yeah.
You know, and we're discussing scenarios together, but we never get beyond those fictional scenarios. We might use the scenarios as a way to build up the confidence of the mentee, but we really want to get to the mentee's experience day to day.
Brilliant, thank you. Gail has got some more questions as well. She's just messaged me, so yeah, she's got loads as well.
Come in. It's one from Pam. Thank you, Pam McFarlane. You've kind of answered some of this actually, Mona, but Pam asks, if a leader enters into a mentoring agreement with a staff member, do you stipulate a time frame, which you have pretty much covered? But also, what happens if a staff member is not engaging in the process and either little progress or negativity can be seen? Any tips for kind of handling that?
Yeah, but both really good questions. The first one around the time period is, I would stipulate a time for review. So rather than saying mentoring will end after 3 months, it's a really good idea to have a kind of break, a potential break point where you say, okay, after a month, we'll review how it's going and how we're getting on with each other and what progress is being made. And I think that links nicely to the when it's not going well, because actually if you've written into the agreement that there is this potential break point and that there's no shame connected to at that point saying, okay, I think I've got as much as I can get from this relationship right now, or the mentor saying, I think you might work better or resonate better with somebody else in the setting. I just feel like, you know, honestly, we're not making that progress together that we'd want to see. If you've written that in, then that takes out some of the difficulty of the conversation. It's still a difficult conversation, but it's definitely not as awkward as getting to kind of week 6 is in this undefined time period and saying, well, this is just horrible for both of us, which is going to leave everybody feeling kind of quite ashamed and upset. So I think building in those periods for review and then having kind of prompts for the review, so structuring the review can also be a helpful kind of protective way of protecting both the mentor and the mentee within the relationship. And I think also just recognizing that we're humans. So not every relationship works, you know, and we all have people that we really resonate with and that we really get on with and who really support us to progress. And we have other situations where it just doesn't work as well. And I think coming at it with the perspective of some of this is going to work really well and some of it might not, again, just takes out some of that upset and distress of when it doesn't work out perfectly.
Thank you. A few more that have come in actually. Dorothy Calderwood, thanks Dorothy. Should mentoring happen in ratio with the children so that modelling and the mentoring work together, or is this something that's taken out?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand that,
I
Gail.
think she means in the room. So if you're doing mentoring and modelling and working at the same time, so it's kind of actually within the setting, actually in situ.
Oh, I see. Well, there are some examples, interesting examples of mentoring on the floor. So trying to have those conversations, but I would see that as quite different from a typical mentoring structure where you would try and kind of create a safe space around the mentoring by maybe removing it from the floor. So what you can have on the floor, I think, are these really interesting, gentle developmental conversations. And there are some lovely examples of that in different settings around the world where they have mentors, guides, pedagogical leaders who steer these conversations on the floor. And they may last 2 minutes, or they might last 20 minutes. And they might be about, trying to cultivate a sense of a person's interests and how they can bring it into their practice. Or it might be very specifically about one particular aspect of pedagogy. So there's lots of ways you can use conversations on the floor. But I would suggest that mentoring as a kind of process ideally would happen as professional learning would. So almost imagining it as a kind of CPD course, in the sense of organizing the time out.
Thank you. Thanks, Mona. Yvonne asks, should your mentor work directly with you? Within early years, sometimes your manager is your mentor, but they don't directly work within your room base. That's interesting.
Yeah, it is really interesting to think about how do you do the matchmaking for mentoring? And I think there are no kind of hard and fast rules about this. I think wherever possible, you're having a conversation with a mentee. So the person who's taking responsibility for setting up the mentoring ideally has a conversation with a mentee as they come on board about what they want from their mentor. So is it to be mentored by somebody that gets what they're doing? So if they're in the toddler room, maybe it's really useful to them to have somebody who understands the toddler room. On the other hand, they might actually request distance. I'm working within my team, but what I want to reflect on is really the dynamics within the team. So I can't do that with another member of this specific team. So they might actually be looking for somebody who is as detached or divorced as possible from the situation that they're in. So I think kind of ideally having a conversation at the beginning with the mentee, setting up the parameters of what's possible, recognizing that it still needs to be something that's feasible for the setting, but where possible, giving that option of, would you like it to be somebody that's close to the work that you do day to day, or would you like it to be somebody that's a bit further away?
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Well, just a quick question, just from my side. One of the things that obviously we come across all the time, it's difficult for early years because ratios are so tight. There's a lot of illness in the settings, and obviously there's a lot of staff shortages where people are trying to recruit at the moment in settings. Where do people find the time then to be able to, if you're thinking it's best practice to potentially not have these mentors, have mentoring sessions happen during a session, being on the shop floor, basically calling it like that? When can settings find the time? Because a lot of people we speak to, unfortunately, they are so snowed out. The managers 99% of the time, counted in ratio themselves because they're having to fill in for a staff member who's not there. So what ideas or tips do you have for settings?
Yeah, it's the eternal question in early years, but there just isn't the time. There isn't the money to make the time. And that's so frustrating for all kinds of professional learning. And that includes mentoring on a very practical level. I think there's a couple of things that are quite nice about mentoring. So mentoring doesn't need to be an hour long. So often when we think about coaching, we think about coaching sessions are, 45 to 50 minutes long. They take this structure and so on. Mentoring can be done over 10-minute slots, it can be done over a 50-minute slot. And so there can be the option of kind of building in different levels of engagement with mentoring that make it slightly more doable. Means that you can kind of, okay, can we catch up for 5 minutes at the end of today? You know, it's not ideal because it's eating into people's time, but it does make it much more feasible than saying, can we take an hour at the end of today in order to go through this process? The other kind of possibility, and this is really nice for embedding mentoring within a setting, but is to take team meetings, which hopefully are kind of scheduled, a nice chunk of time, maybe on a fortnightly basis, on a monthly basis, and dedicating a particular chunk of that team meeting to mentoring conversations. So let's say we've kind of scheduled a 45-minute team meeting. Well, maybe every 3 team meetings, we have some built-in time, 20 minutes for mentoring conversations to happen. And that can be a way to show that, you know, you appreciate what mentoring brings to the setting, that you're really prioritizing it and making the time for it. And it's also a good way to kind of prompt the meetings, because I think a difficult thing about mentoring is that people can actually be loving it, but don't necessarily do it, you know, and so they don't commit to doing it. So if you can kind of structure a time where mentoring conversations could happen, that's a really useful thing for everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Gail, have you got any other questions on your side?
I do actually, yes. I have a couple here. Do you have any tips I can encourage the members of my team to take on mentoring when they lack confidence? I know that you said earlier that obviously in an ideal situation, everybody would be on board, everybody would want to get involved, but obviously there's going to be lots of people that don't feel confident or just don't feel that they want to get involved. Any tips to kind of encourage that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is confidence to mentor rather than confidence to be mentored. So I think one thing that's really effective on a practical level is bringing together, if you can, if the size of your organization permits it, but having a cohort of mentors. So rather than it just being, I'm recruiting one new mentor, who's it going to be? But saying, okay, we need a new team of mentors. And then you can induct, ideally, those mentors together. They can also kind of buddy with each other and support each other through the process. You can run through things like the expectations or the skills and the dispositions. You can run through all of that together. So actually, if there's an opportunity to have a bit of a cohort structure for your mentors so that your mentors feel like a team in themselves, that can really boost the confidence of individuals. I think also stressing what a good mentor is can be helpful. So explaining that actually at the heart of mentoring is listening, and that when you have individuals within your setting who are good at listening, chances are with a bit of support, they're going to be great mentors. So I think, as with so many things in early years, we tend to overplay what we think is necessary in order to do a great job of something within the organization, and we undersell ourselves. And so I think really stressing kind of what's at the heart of mentoring and why do I think you would be fantastic to do this is because actually I see you doing wonderful listening with your team. I see you being sensitive to other people's feelings. It's that empathy that's going to make you a great mentor. So I think there's a bit of mentoring required to get those mentors on board, as it were, but it pays off.
Thank you. Dorothy's asked, could you give us an example of a mentoring conversation? This follows on really well from what you were just saying. Would it be to do with their practice, extending the learning, making sure the curriculum is followed? How does that conversation start?
Yeah, great question. I mean, often a mentoring conversation, you know, ideally, once you've got that relationship to the point where the mentee can genuinely open up, then really they're steering it. So a question like, what's on your mind at the moment? I know it sounds ridiculously simple, but a chat that starts with what's on your mind at the moment, or how are you finding work at the moment? How are you finding things? Allows an individual to take it to wherever their frustrations might be, wherever the gaps in their knowledge or their skills might be, as well as kind of progression, areas of progression that they really want to tap into. So they might say, well, actually, I'm really distressed at the moment and I'm thinking about leaving because I'm finding it really hard to work with my team at the moment. And that mentoring conversation that follows from that is going to look and feel very different to somebody saying, I think I'm generally doing okay, but I find it really hard to support the children in when I'm drafted into working in the baby room. I just don't know what to do with the babies. I'm really struggling with that. And so one of those conversations is going to be about team dynamics. One of those conversations is going to be about practice and how do you build up that practice. I think in both of those situations, what's important is remembering that you are not the expert. So you're not expected to be an expert as a mentor in team dynamics, right? What you need to do is this, and this, and you'll solve your team problems. That's not going to happen. But asking that person to kind of sit back and reflect on what exactly are those dynamics? Can you tell me more about them day to day? Why are you finding that particularly frustrating? How does this relate to previous experiences that you've had? What are your options? What are you thinking about as your choices in this situation? So it's kind of questions to open that person up rather than trying to solve that problem immediately. Similarly, with the person that says, I'm just not comfortable with the babies, it's asking, okay, well, it's great that you've recognized that. Let's think about that together. Is there a way for you to become more comfortable working in the baby room? Do you need to be in the baby room? Is this actually about a conversation with a manager and asking to play to your strengths more? Is that feasible? So on. So it's all questions. I was recently in a conversation with somebody in my own work, not an official mentor at all, but I was telling her about a frustration that I have at work. And she just came back with such a powerful question and said, is that something you would feel comfortable talking to your manager about? And it wasn't, just complete game changer, because actually, rather than just listening to my frustration and nodding along sympathetically or giving me like, could you do that? You need to do this. It was somewhere in the middle of just saying, one of the options seems to be this. Would you feel comfortable with that? And so opening up those possibilities, I think, in a mentoring conversation is what matters. But the content ideally is going to depend on the mentee and what they're experiencing.
Thank you. Dorothy just said she loves that you're actually empowering them to come to a plan. So that's well done. Thank you so much. Heidi has just said, do you have a document that these conversations, do you have to document these conversations, as this does also take time?
A great question. Overall, I would say no, unless as a mentor, you would find it helpful to do so. So if we're remembering that first question that we had around, do you need to report this back to a line manager? And we said, well, only in extreme cases, really, is this getting reported back to somebody else. So if there were a situation where we've got a disclosure happening, then ideally you begin documenting at that point, because actually that's becoming something else that's, shifted into a different sphere. But if it's the mentoring that's happening, I would be jotting down things as a mentor that I would find it useful to remember for my next session. Yeah, so if you think you're going to forget some of the issues that they've brought to you, some of the frustrations, if you're mentoring quite a few different people and you're worried about getting muddled, then making some notes for yourself that are going to be helpful is fantastic. But I don't see the need really for documenting in any particularly formal way the mentoring conversations that you're having. And it can be really off-putting, let's be honest, for a mentee, if as they're speaking, you're kind of writing everything down on a clipboard. It gets in the way of that deep listening. So I think ideally that you might make some notes in order to support your work as a mentor, but no, this shouldn't become paperwork.
No, that actually then probably answers the question that Yvonne asked, because she's asked, would you record mentor meetings to set targets for like follow-up mentoring? Is it going to be a more fluid approach, or do you think it needs to be a more structured approach?
That's starting to sound slightly more like coaching.
Yeah.
So when we get to the point of, you know, we're going to document your targets and we're going to document the progress against those targets, all really useful things to do, but it's starting to sound more kind of in the coaching domain. With the mentoring, I would try and keep it more fluid than that, and recognize that actually there might not be any targets at the end of a session. You know, mentoring, you've not had a bad session if you get to the end and there isn't like a takeaway. So between now and next week, you're going to be doing this. You don't need to get to that place with mentoring. You might end up in a place where there are more questions than answers. We're really playing the long game with mentoring. We're not trying to solve problems immediately.
Yeah, I suppose as well, from any mentor, I mean, I've worked with some mentors myself. There has to be establishing that trust first, and that does, you know, builds up over time before you're not going to have the open book policy as you started. Well, some people might, but you know, normal people, you have your guard up a little bit before you kind of feel, is this going to be a safe space to share something that I'm really struggling with, for example? So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. And I think target setting is fantastic, you know, and needs to be done within nurseries, but that mentoring space can really flourish if it's kind of removed from the target setting and it's allowed to just kind of take its own shape, I think.
Brilliant. Mona, thank you. My goodness, it's been amazing. And I want to keep in the time, because I know all the practitioners who's joined us today is so busy and everybody has got get back to their day job. So thank you so much for your time today. You have been fantastic and I have loved every second. And thank you everybody for joining us today as well. You can already register for the webinar on parental.com for our next month's webinar. The recording will be shared, and of course, if you have registered for the webinar, you can claim your free CPD certificate for today of our expert Mona. Thank you so much, Mona, and thanks again everybody, and have a lovely day. Have a fantastic time. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.